Now, in this session 4, we will talk about the changes in food and leisure for South Korean consumers after 1997 financial crisis. Now, going back to 1980s, it was a good time for South Koreans, except there were a lot of protests on the streets demanding the middle class and students and workers demanding democratization. But as far as the economy was concerned, the situation was very good, and South Korean won was strong against the US dollar. And that's why at that time when you traveled overseas, you could feel you are rich. And now this time lasted nearly 1 decade. But until 1997, when Asian financial crisis hit South Korea, now everything will change. And first of all, the exchange rate became so bad. So now going overseas was difficult unless you are rich. But then of course there were enough number of rich people in South Korea. But ordinary people, so many people lost their jobs because many South Korean companies collapsed in this hit by Asian financial crisis, and they have economic hardship. And everything was different, and people were more careful about spending, and people felt they became poorer and insecure, and the suicide rate has been going up drastically in this period, and it even continues until today even. Anyway, also after the crisis, South Korean economic system, as elsewhere in the world, underwent a highly liberalist changes. And the gap between rich people and poor people were widening ever, and this bred economic polarization within the society, and South Korean politics also become much more polarized as well. So many things that happened after 1997 can be explained what happened in this short period of time. The gap between rich people and poor people, and the political polarization and so on that continue even today. And this brought changes in diet habits of Korean consumers. And now people prefer more inexpensive food, which means many restaurants, they started to offer more inexpensive food because that was highly demanded. And the people consume more rationally. Before then, actually South Koreans would replace old furniture with a new one very quickly, and they would not wear clothes very long because they felt very rich. But after this, especially poor people, their consumption behavior totally changed. And people try to restrict eating out. And when they did, they would look for something cheaper. And interestingly, this was a time when South Korean culinary trend turned to very hot-tasted food. Now, tteokbokki is all red because it's full of chili pepper, and things like that didn't exist before, like a buldak, which is fiery chicken, and also ramen become much hotter. And even though Shinramen itself was produced first in 1986 by Nongshim, but now by this time, almost every ramen companies in South Korea started to sell very hot ramen noodle. Anyway, the South Koreans per capita chili pepper consumption is one of the highest in the world. each year, every South Koreans consume 4 kilograms of chili pepper a year. Now, this is a very big number. And Korea's neighbor, Japan, this is probably one of the lowest. Somehow Japanese never developed the taste of hot food, but that's also changing today because of the growing popularity of South Korean food. Okay, so more specifically, what happened, what changed came in this era in South Koreans' culinary life and culinary culture. Now, as I said, there was a huge, large-scale loss of jobs, and people had to save money rather than spending, so that brought families would spend less money on food compared to the earlier decade, and they demand inexpensive food, and they would consume only essential food items, and while minimizing eating out. And because they were looking for inexpensive alternatives, even our Korean barbecue culture was turning from beef-based bulgogi and galbi and things to samgyeopsal. So this was a time when samgyeopsal's popularity rose rather quickly because pork was much cheaper than beef in Korean market. And even in alcohol, soju regained its popularity in this time. So samgyeopsal and soju became a typical the office workers the eating out together with their colleagues. And this was a time when South Koreans turning from Korean beef, the Hanwoo beef, to imported beef, which was cheaper from America and from Australia and so on. So this was a time that Los Angeles galbi, LA galbi became popular in South Korea. And also the hot tasted foods such as raboki, well, that's a combination of ramen and tteokbokki, and also jampong and so on. These hot items went up in terms of sales during this economic depression. And we will explain that why economic depression time, the hot food tend to be popular later. And following the neoliberalization of economy, because so many people, especially middle-aged men, lost their jobs. And what should they do? The easiest thing for them to do was opening a small restaurant. Because the number of these people was so many, they tried to find something new and something different. Now, this brought interesting diversity in the food service industry in South Korea. Because until then, most restaurants were, when it is Korean food, 한식, that's a seolleongtang, gomtang, and so on, and bulgogi and thing. And otherwise, they were Western, the fast food, such as a burger and pizza and so on. But it was at this time that because so many laid off middle-aged men, they tried to jump into this food service industry, which requires relatively less capital and less skill, but this brought eventually, it had an effect of diversifying South Korean food industry, which contributed to the amazing need to contemporary culinary culture. Now, going back to samgyeopsal and soju, that's a typical samgyeopsal and soju. It doesn't cost too much because samgyeopsal is cheaper, and even less expensive samgyeopsal came into the market by the business ingenuity. And when you sit around with your colleagues after a day's work, over soju, and you are happy and you are full. And also, this was a time when less expensive food items such as 곱창, which is intestines of the beef or pork, and now they also gained popularity because this food is cheaper, and if you add good ingredients and so on and make it hot, anyway, it fills up and you feel good. So all these food items gained popularity after 1997, and the soju, not to mention, and as I said, LA galbi over the more expensive Korean beef. And now this is a time for us to think about why hot taste food was so popular in this time. And according to scientists, they say actually hot taste is not a taste itself, but actually it is a pain. The hot taste, actually you are going through a pain. And now this pain stimulates the exertion of endorphins, the hormones in your body, and now these endorphins eventually make you feel better, happier, and more excited. And so that's the effect. And so that's probably the reason why after 1997 in South Korean food industry, everything became very hot. Not everything, but most of things became hot, and this hot food became very, very popular. So on the far left, you see chili pepper. The Koreans consume 4 kilograms every year per person. And in the middle is raboki, that's ramen, and tteokbokki mixed together with hot sauce. And that's very cheap, but it makes you feel full and happy eventually. And then far right is the bulldog ramen. I dare not have tried it yet, but it looks very, very hot. And there are definitely, this is very popular. And even in Western supermarkets these days, you find some of them in your local supermarket. And now, in our next session, we will talk about the Korean fried chicken, which has become very popular everywhere in the world.